Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Johannesburg Business School's discussion series. I must check with Liesel. I believe we are nearing about 30 of these discussions that we've had since the ominous lockdown in South Africa. And it's a really exciting moment because to clock up this number and to do this in this year of uncertainty has actually filled a gap, and a very, very important gap for us to have these exciting, enriching, and very insightful discussions. And today's no exception. I'm really, really looking forward to this. It's a fantastic discussion with Guy Martin, somebody who has done a lot of work around the space of organizational development and pushing these areas forward. My name is Lyle White. I am with the Johannesburg Business School. We have been doing this work with a number of speakers like Guy, and what I'm going to do in the meantime, while we wait for the speakers to log on and to buff this process, I'll share with you my screen. And with that, we will be able to look at the rules of engagement and how we are going to be proceeding with this as we go forward today. So just bear with us as we wait for this, and let me just make sure that you are able to share you're able to share our screen. There we go. There we go. So there's the topic of discussion today, how organizations can bounce forward to drive economic recovery and future growth. I suppose that's important, is the sustainable growth. We always look at the drivers of economic growth. I would argue that what Guy is doing and working with organizations and firms are the pistons of economic growth. And that's what I think he's looking at finding a way to actually create greater innovation and resilience in these periods of very, very interesting periods of uncertainty, I might add. I'll get back to our guest speaker today, Guy Martin. But for now, let me just go through a little bit of the housekeeping, as it were, and a little bit of information about the Johannesburg Business School. The Johannesburg Business School is located in Mill Park, Johannesburg. That is the view from the Johannesburg Business School building, which is a fantastic, iconic blue building that many of you will know on the Johannesburg landscape. And that's just the view of the skyline of Johannesburg. Unfortunately, today, it's not exactly that type of view. We've had a rainy period in Johannesburg, but all that much better because we need that rain, and it's a wonderful entry into the summer months. What I want to mention, though, is the emphasis and the focus of the Johannesburg Business School. That which differentiates or distinguishes us from other business schools is the focus on the growing and scaling of small and medium-sized businesses. That is all important, and I think it speaks to this, this notion of economic recovery and sustainable economic growth is not only looking for jobs, but creating work that will spur further jobs for those in an economy like ours, and obviously expand into other African markets in the process. One important point, and I would be amiss without mentioning something to this effect, is that our flagship program, the MBA, kicked off in January 2020. We have our next cohort coming in 2021. But a very exciting moment here at the Johannesburg Business School is the launch of the online MBA. So we have literally made geography redundant in a way. If you can't get to Johannesburg, you can certainly do the MBA through the online process of the JBS MBA, which is now in many regards regarded as one of the top MBAs across the continent because we're one of the first movers to do so. So have a look at this. It really, really is an exciting moment, not only for the Johannesburg Business School, but for MBAs in general, as we enter this period of online learning across Africa and across the world at large. Another important point about the discussion today, but also in growing and scaling small businesses, is the conscious impact on society and the role that business plays in society at large. All that much more important in the South African context. So that, without further ado, I just want to remind those of you that have not logged on before, what we do is we do a brief introduction from our guest speaker today. Guy Martin is going to be handling that. There is a chat function at the bottom of your screen. Please don't be shy. Fire away your questions and your comments. And I'm pleading with you right now. Keep them short, brief, to the point. I'm going to be fielding those questions and using them to engage with the discussion with Guy following his introduction. So please do bring those forward and start from the very beginning with some of your comments and questions, keeping them very, very direct to the speaker and to us on the panel. A little bit of information about our guest speaker today. And I do urge you to read his short bio. I know we circulate it to everybody, but this one is one of a difference. And I do want to look at, I'd love you to have a look at some of the work that he has done and how he has taken this very, very interesting work in the special forces arena, as it were, and the SOS, and he's translated this into basically organizational development and innovation around strategic thinking in the space, but also using empirics in that process. Very, very exciting, very interesting career. And those of you that would like to actually connect with Guy after this, I suggest you do that to not only enrich your lives through an interesting conversation, but just to really have those very important and interesting conversations going forward. So I'm really looking forward to the start of these interesting conversations, Guy. And for those of you that want to read further into this, please dig into his bio and go onto the websites and try and access more of the material that he has. But this is way of a brief introduction, really, and for you to get to grips with some of Guy's thoughts, his approaches to this, and to look at how we can bounce forward. I love that idea of bouncing forward. Instead of the old notions of leapfrogging, we need to bounce our way forward. So, Guy, I'm going to hand over to you. I'm going to de-share my screen, but I'm just giving you a warm welcome on behalf of the Johannesburg Business School, and we're really looking forward to this conversation going forward. Over to you, Guy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lyle. Good morning, everybody. Wonderful to be here. So I'm going to be talking about a range of things, but particularly in terms of the seismic impact of the lockdown on businesses, particularly SMEs, and how we assist them to be able to reconfigure and realign around a North Star, which has shifted, because it's like in a seismic shift, you know, with a massive earthquake. Suddenly, nothing is quite the same. The North Star is in a different place to where it was 6 months ago. And obviously, there needs to be some kind of adaptation in terms of how to reconfigure the organization and all of its people around providing a different value creation for clients. So clients are also going to be expecting something different to what they were experiencing pre-March. The clients won't even necessarily know what that is. So this is an incredible opportunity in terms of being able to realign your organizations around the future and make sure that all of your people understand exactly what the nature of that world is and how they can contribute to that. And the reason why I say bounce forward is bouncing back post the lockdown in many ways is just simply not going to be enough. There has to be a new way forward, and we all need to get on the front foot. So I'm going to run you through a journey that we take our clients on in terms of being able to recodify the DNA of their organizations to be able to be future fit and relevant going forward. So when I'm talking about DNA, I come from the perspective that every organization has its own unique genetic code, and that can be discovered mathematically. And the idea in the psychology of it is to co-create involving all of your people in a process to be able to arrive at an algebraic equation, a mathematical formula that codifies the philosophy that is necessary to be able to move towards, to transform so that your future strategy is going to be properly aligned in terms and supported by a culture. All right, so there are kind of three components that I'm going to be talking about. And there's a scientific element, and there's an artistic element, and there's a transformational element. And so very much strongly statistically initially, how can we work out the codification of a future philosophy? But we need to begin with what is the strategy of the organization from a leadership perspective, because there needs to be a review in terms of how we're going to direct our service offerings to the market out there. So one needs to begin from a leadership perspective in terms of asking yourselves, what do we want to become famous for? And the reason why that question needs to be kicked off with is because the formulation in terms of how to configure your organization is very much of an internal process. So one has to begin from a leadership perspective in terms of truly challenging yourselves as leadership in terms of what we want to become famous for in the future. And that can be distilled down to a very succinct and concise articulation. And what we're saying is, once that has been defined in terms of what we want to become famous for, the external objective, we're saying that there's a formula that can be discovered mathematically in terms of how to get there and how to get everybody on board in terms of reconfiguring around the new North Star. So really, in a nutshell, the journey is about growth and assisting CEOs to drive growth by increasing the alignment of people to business goals by 50%. So that's quite a strong statement, because there's skin in the game and an objective. But in the 130 projects that we've run, it's always achieved if complied with. So it's about growth, and it's about aligning people, and it's about ensuring that there's a metric that indicates that you're on track and you are shifting the reality of the organization. Now, if you look at the bottom of the screen, and behind me, incidentally, where I am in my boardroom is I have this art gallery in a mathematical equation that defines the quintessential philosophy and culture that we have to live by in terms of maximizing our impact in terms of the world out there. But you'll see, Lucy, that there's an algebraic format here. There's a numerator, there's a denominator, it equals blueprints, and there's representation of each of the elements in art, because that creates just a continuous consciousness for all of my people in terms of how we got to function in terms of maximizing our success and our value creation. So just a really quick background about us. So 19 years in business, 130 clients in 36 countries, focusing mainly in the blue chip sector. Around about 500,000 employees have gone through this particular journey. So where did this come from? That's me, age 24. So I'm a fighter pilot by training. I used to fly the Harrier jump jet in the Royal Air Force in the UK. But the relevance is I'm holding a paper map in my left hand. And in those days, in the 1980s, we had nothing like the technology of today, but we had to be able to operate these highly complex machines in highly complex formations, in highly complex sorties, mainly in anti-tank operations. And we had to know hundreds of mathematical equations in our heads. So we were constantly making calculations in terms of being able to make sense of all these complexities. And I suddenly realized that maths was quite cool, that it simplifies complex issues. And when you know the formula, and it is true, it will always be true. So from my 20s, I really was fascinated in terms of the application of mathematics. I came back to South Africa, started a logistics business, which is where I developed this model as an owner-managed business, as an SME, to be able to align all of my people around my strategy, using my curiosity around mathematics and also my application in terms of expression through art. So I'm not going to go through too much detail around that, but this is just a bit about my background. And then in my 40s, I sold that business to a private equity firm, and I started Blueprints. Okay, so one of the reasons why we exist is that the degree to which your people are actually with you, see what you see, and know how they can contribute to the end result is actually limited. So Gallup run polls every year around the world in terms of establishing the degree to which employees are actually with you. They're engaged, they're committed, and they're making a consistent contribution. But the results are actually significantly suboptimal in the views of any employer. And they look at three constructs. Either employees are engaged, they're committed, making a consistent contribution, or they're disengaged, they're going through the motions for a paycheck, or they're actively disengaged, they're unhappy, and they undermine the system. Now, every organization is going to have all three of those effectively as a spectrum. The problem about that is that the results show that well over 80% of employees within organizations are either disengaged or actively disengaged. Now, that is obviously a problem, because one is you're getting a unsatisfactory result in terms of your investment as far as your payroll is concerned. But also it means, from a leadership perspective, that if people are not with you to the degree that you would like them to be, obviously there's going to be a significant issue around the effectiveness of the organization. So the research shows also why they're disengaged. So there are three main reasons. Either the value system of the employees are inconsistent with the value system of the organization, or vice versa, or the issues with direct reports. That relationship between employees and their manager is vital. If it's good, if it's competent and strong, they're engaged. If it's not, it's a leading cause of disengagement. And the third main reason is if employees are blind to the bigger picture and they just end up as a cog in the system, it means that they don't connect with the higher purpose and the bigger picture of the organization. So those are the three main reasons. All right, now there are a series of algorithms, and I'm going to be getting into where artificial intelligence meets human intelligence at a particular point, but there are a series of algorithms involved in terms of the establishment and the transformation, the establishment of a new philosophy mathematically, and a transformation of the organization. This, in fact, is the formula for the standard distribution curve. So just stick with me in terms of the concept here. Now, imagine your organization. In terms of you wanting to achieve a specific goal, you will always have some kind of equilibrium around the energies if you look at a bell curve. And to the right-hand side of the mean, there are going to be a whole bunch of enabling factors, behaviors, practices, and principles that the more they exist, the closer you're going to get to your goal. But every organization has a dipolar force. It's not dissimilar to force field analysis, which is a well understood and accepted academic notion that there are opposing forces also in organizations that hold you back. So imagine on the left-hand side of the bell curve, there are a range of disabling factors, behaviors, practices, and principles that will keep you from being able to deliver on your goal. So every organization arrives at a point of equilibrium. But in terms of being able to really make a difference, you want to transform that organization, shift the bell curve to the right. How can we do more of the good stuff, less of the bad stuff? And how can we measure that shift so that we are becoming more oriented around the future relevance of the market out there? So if you turn this bell curve on its side and you look at the structure of the algebraic equation, which is what we use in terms of the foundation of these blueprints that we create with our clients, is that there's a wonderful correlation. You'll see the enabling constructive factors and disabling destructive factors that I was talking about earlier. And you'll see how those correlate very nicely with the algebraic equation, where the numerator is always constructive to value outcome and the denominator is always destructive to value outcome. So the journey essentially is how to co-create with all of your people fully inclusively what are going to be in the future are absolute non-negotiable enabling factors, behaviors, practices, and principles that are good for our business that we have to have and must be maximized. But conversely, what are those disabling factors that are bad for business that we can't afford to have and must be minimized? So there's the logic behind structuring these organizational philosophies in an algebraic equation. And all of these inputs come bottom up. Leadership determine what's on the right-hand side of the equal sign, what we want to become famous for. And then what we do is we go in and we interview everybody within the organization, asking two simple open-ended questions. What do you think we got to be doing more of? And what do you think we got to be doing less of as organization X to achieve what's on the right-hand side of the equal sign of the formula? So leadership one-on-one, the balance of the people online, and then we do a lot of blue-collar environments as well, and the manual processes. But everybody has their say in terms of what they believe is necessary to do more of and less of to be able to shift that bell curve to the right. So now there's obviously a huge amount of replication that comes out of those processes, and we have thousands and tens of thousands of inputs. So then we get into factor analysis to establish what are those unique enabling factors, those discrete themes that are coming through to do more of and less of. It takes about a week in terms of and capping it right about 10,000 inputs, so that there's absolute clarity. What are those unique discrete themes to do more of and less of? Always round about 30 do more, 30 do less that come through that process. Now those themes are then put back to all the employees in an election. where everybody votes in the election with a limited number of votes. But now they're voting on the consolidated views of everybody within the organization, so their peers in effect. And what that does do in the election, that throws up an election result where you can see high vote count do more, high vote count do less, and working on the Pareto distribution, the 80-20 principle. It's about taking the most resonant enabling factors to do more of, and the most resonant disabling factors to do less of, to be able to distill those inputs down with high statistical quantification that you got all the right issues that have come out of the process. It then gets rather technical in terms of establishing the correlations or lack thereof between leadership and the employees. And there are always disconnects, by the way. And it's about crafting the formula in conjunction with the statistical outcomes where leadership have blind spots, the employees have blind spots. You consolidate that and you end up with those surviving numerator factors and denominator factors, which are then weighted. There's a weighting process to establish the exponents and the multiples in the equation. And then one arrives at what we call a written formula of, this is in fact an international car hire company, of the absolute non-negotiables of our philosophy going forward that we've discovered that our customers are going to need in terms of us staying relevant in the future. So these are literal descriptions of what is crucial to do more of and less of. So there's the kind of the formation of the philosophical formula. But now that's got to come to life, because it's one thing to intellectually understand what the formula is in terms of what we're going to strive to do differently, but there's another one to live it. And then it needs to be infused with a new culture. Now, the thing about culture is that it's intangible, and it's very sticky, and it's difficult to define, but we all know it's powerful. So if you're in an environment whereby the high levels of trust or low levels of trust, we can't see that, and we don't intellectualize that on a cerebral level, but we feel it profoundly, and it impacts on the way that we behave. So we know that the intangible factors are crucial. So we want to infuse a new culture so we can actually live this formula. So what happens then is we run a competition with all our clients' people to come up with creative ideas in terms of how to express each of those constructs in the formula in a piece of art. So best ideas are chosen, normally run as a competition, and then we go into production. The reason why we're using art is because of the power of the cerebral cortex in terms of the association of ideas and visuals. So from the ancient times to the modern era, we associate very quickly in graphics. And once the graphic is understood to represent a construct, it is always going to be our default in terms of understanding. And through regular use, they become very recognizable, iconographic representations of individual constructs. So we're also moving back towards a graphic language, and people don't read as much as they did. So that's just the reality of the world. So then we go into production to produce individual artworks. We produce 5,500 pieces of art in our journey, and each one is a translation into right brain language, represents a specific behavior or factor or practice or principle. So this, for example, is chiseling our future. It's about personal development, it's training and development within the organization, but also demonstrating that the individual is accountable for their personal development as well. And then they come together as these art galleries. They're all completely unique because they have different strategies, but there's representation of the formula constructs in art form, so that the visibility and the reiterations are consistent in terms of reminding everybody in terms of what we created or co-created as an organization. So here's some examples. And again, it's about shifting behavior. You know, there's going to be a new workspace norm going forward. And to make those adjustments, we need to behave differently. Now, behavior is largely driven by how people feel about things versus how they intellectualize them. So here's an example. How do you feel when you see the words, get it right the first time versus that? So this is an example of one construct, one icon in one of our clients' art galleries There's the literal definition, and that's the visceral definition. They communicate the same construct, but they're communicating from different sides of the brain. Another example, how do you feel when you see the words backstabbing in politics versus that? So a very simple translation of written into graphic. Say the same thing, mean the same thing, but they have different mechanisms regarding language of left and right brain. So they come together, all of them, as these art galleries. As I said, all completely different. It's amazing how organizations, even in the same industry, tend to have very different DNA constructs. But because it's around the specific objective of the strategy of the organization, the realization in terms of how we're going to get there, and because the goal varies within organizations, obviously the DNA will as well. So, but they are the unique genetic codes for each organization to move towards in terms of transforming effectively. Here are just some other examples. Can do, impossible is nothing. Embracing transformation, diversity, and change. That's a chameleon with licorice all sorts all over it. Bending over backwards in terms of service excellence. Some denominator factors, passing the buck. That's lack of accountability. All talk, no action. That's a parrot with a microphone. 9 to 5 mentality. Those are sheep arriving at the lift at 5 o'clock. So just illustrations of how any literal construct can be translated into a graphic construct. So they come together as these art galleries. This is what they look like. So this is our first ever 94.7 in 2001. But they're in the workspace, because otherwise one runs an initiative whereby, or a workshop whereby everyone sort of has this heightened awareness, and then it goes into a PowerPoint presentation or a draw or something like that. But it doesn't have consciousness. It doesn't have this ability to translate into the transformation of the organization fundamentally into a fitter state. So one needs to bring consciousness into the equation. So the art is designed to keep the awareness and the consciousness growing in the minds of everybody, but also as a celebration to everybody in terms of what they were invited to be part of, co-creating the future for the organization. This is a city planning organization in Singapore. About half our business is international at the moment. This is an external one coming down the pathway and done out of metalwork. This is where it is at Deloitte, in the process of being moved from their Woodbeat offices to Waterfall near Midrand. But it's big and it's bold and it's in pride of place. This is at Sun International, head office in Sandton, and then replications of this all the way from Sun City through to Table Bay. This is a futures trading business in China. High wearing vinyls on the floor, but all designed to make sure that many, many, many times a day, we're re-engaging with our formula. This is what we got to strive towards so we can bounce forward and be more relevant into the future. This is an external one. This is one just being installed. And then this is what we call the dictionary. How to then link, again, left brain and right brain, the graphics to the wording of it. So there's no ambiguity in terms of what each of those elements mean. All right, so as I was saying earlier, the trick now is once the formula has been built, or if you do this yourselves or whatever, the big trick is that culture is incredibly sticky and it doesn't want to transform. It's like a personality. Whether it's healthy or unhealthy, it defaults to staying the same, which obviously is a problem. But the opportunity now is that you have a consensual view of this is what we want to be. This is our formula. This is how we're going to change the future. This is how we're going to bounce forward. So there is an inherent desire, because it's consensually created, to move towards that, because that's what everybody wants in the future. So what happens then is the formula is measured, has to be measured in terms of establishing metrics around the degree to which we're living those enabling and disabling factors. So what happens once a quarter is that every employee will score each of the icon elements on a 3-point scoring system. Each one happens seldom, average, or often. Our system scores them as a 1, a 2, or a 3. So we can aggregate the performance of each of the elements in the formula in terms of the degree to which they are being lived in reality. But people are challenged also to recommend actions. What actions are required to do more of these good things? What actions are required to do less of these bad things? And then they are requested to vote on one top line, one bottom line, high priority focus. That's what we got to be focusing on right now. And what that does do is it gives a metric to the intangible factors. So this is like your invisible balance sheet. These are your intangible assets. These are your intangible liabilities. But now we know what they are, and now we're bringing metrics to them. And what we can measure, we can manage. So each leader would get the results of their environment, the degree to which their, in this case, enabling factors are functioning. The dark blue graph shows current performance. The light blue graph shows previous performance. The bar chart at the top shows relative movement. So the metrics start to bring and inform leaders in terms of how their environments are living by the overall formula. Now, also, this is logical, but this is what we find. Local is lekker. As long as individual leaders are ensuring that their environments are living by the formula, they're dealing with their what we call micro formula, which are just top 2 enablers and top 2 disablers. Along with those actions, that we support our leaders in terms of being able to implement those actions so they can get a better calculation and a better metric next time around. Because built into KPIs are their ability to feedback, implement actions, get their index up, and participation. So the average, it's about establishing a future improved world, particularly bouncing forward what that is going to be to project it and move towards it. So the average growth of an index, which is a calculation of the numerator scores over denominator scores, so it's a ratio in effect, from base measurement to over 18 months is on average around about 50%. Then it tends to plateau, but as long as there's a differential between where you were at base and where you are now, it means that you got evidence that transformation has taken place. The formula is true. It's doing its job. It is delivering on what's to the right-hand side of the equal sign, the North Star. Okay, so best companies to work for, I've done a study where you see the black square. In every case, the rankings have gone up. So people become more engaged. But more important than that is that they are focused on the transformation of the organization to be more strategically relevant. So all just about shifting the bell curve to the right. How does one do more of the good stuff, less of the bad stuff, transform the organization to bounce forward, to becoming more future fit? And building a business that is valuable to me as an individual, my company, and our future, because you get that balance right between the aspirations of the leadership, the aspirations of the people. You get that connection. There's a magical synthesis. And to link leadership to people and people to leadership. It's an astonishing process. At the point that you look at the election results around the priorities for the organization or what's critical to do differently, there's always some kind of gaps between leadership and the people. And it's about closing those gaps to integrate a formula that applies to everybody's legitimate requirements to be able to shift that bell curve to the right. And then there's a digital program in terms of driving initiatives like a war on waste. My brilliant idea, I take a photograph, a video. If we change it this way, we can save X per day, etc. Onboarding people, so everybody knows what the philosophy is and the culture into which they're joining the organization. And then initiatives with clients as well, just to keep the thing completely relevant and alive every day. But also, it's a form of AI because it thinks for itself. And I call it where AI meets HI. And if you look at the articulations of definitions of AI and HI, they are in essence very similar. But these are the kind of 4 main constructs regarding AI, and it's about making accurate predictions around the future in terms of projecting where the organization is going. These are all AI constructs. saving mental energy because it thinks for you in many ways, because one is processing inputs, producing outputs. Those inputs are put back into the system, and they create this virtuous cycle in terms of continuous improvement. Minimizing complexity, because that's what they do. Going back to my military days and all the equations, whether it was pi r squared or 2 pi r or force equals mv squared or speed equals distance over time, the point is the formula is always right. So as long as you apply the formula, it simplifies it into something that is always true, minimizing complexity, and then elevating and driving efficiencies, because it's all about the transformation of the organization to be future fit to deliver on the external requirements of the client. Evidenced by the rise in the index showing that the organization's efficiencies are growing out continuously. And this is my last slide. It was also my first slide, but Shakespeare sums it up very nicely in Hamlet. And it's, to be or not to be, what is the question? So the question is absolutely crucial. That's what we want to become famous for. Once that's established, what do we have to be or not to be able to achieve that? So it's a nice little sort of formulaic roundup using Shakespeare's words. All right, so that's the essence of the journey. That's obviously very high level, but it kind of gives you a sense in terms of understanding that there are opposing forces in any organization or any relationship. They're good things and they're bad things, but how to configure them in such a way that we understand what they are, we know what the priorities are, we've got consciousness of it because it's visual, we measure it, we have feedback processes, and we're committed through accountability processes to ensure that there's proper transformation. So now, thank you very much. That's my 20 minutes.
Great. Thank you so much, Guy. Thank you very much for that. And also literally taking us on a tour de force of what you do for organizations, but also what I always find fascinating is where the people come from, so that and their personal journey and how they actually and how this contributes to the impact that they are having and the conversations that we have. This is quite intentionally a forum or a platform that we hold to have these interesting conversations. So I see there's a lot more work that can be done. Guy, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to de-share your screen so that our wonderful faces can dominate the full screen for now. But it's just also for us just to have this conversation. Look, you've stimulated a whole bunch of areas. One of the areas, or some of the areas that we really do look at, is around organizational purpose, or the purpose of business really at the highest level, but then down to organizational purpose and how we can articulate personal purpose into our organizational purpose. And that's really something that you have touched on. You've also raised a very, very interesting thing. You've basically said mathematical applications are very cool. It's actually when you see the outcome of them that they actually become very cool. So I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are interested to hear more about that. But I'm very interested in this intersection of purpose and culture. And there are quite a few questions that have come through around the cultural dynamic. We always hear about, the old adage of culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think I want to start on that. What is your thoughts on this, especially in what I'd regard as a high context environment like South Africa, a culturally diverse area, a culturally diverse context? And one of the things, and I'm going to get back to this, is around intercultural communication, because what you've taken us through is a journey, but I think the next step around this would be around intercultural communication. But let's start with, does culture really eat strategy for breakfast every time? Your thoughts on that?
There's absolutely no question, Lyle, that is the case, because it is so utterly self-consuming in terms of how the organization functions. Just on the question of strategy, because we always deal with strategy because it's on the right-hand side of the equal sign. So that's kind of determined up front. What is interesting in dealing with largely blue chip organizations is I would estimate round about 2/3 of organizations' leadership don't even have a clear strategy. That's the one thing. And those who do have demonstrated a suboptimal ability to have implemented that strategy. So one of the reasons why culture eats strategy is typically quite weak, even if it has been articulated. The thing about culture is that culture is, and it's not necessarily a good or bad thing. It is its own psychology. It's like an organization has a collective psyche in terms of how it functions, how it thinks, how it behaves. And one of the examples I want to give around culture is it's like a family. As with any family, and I've never come across, and when I ask people in the audience to raise their hands, who comes from a fully functional family? Think cousins, grandparents, whatever. And no one's ever put their hands up. Now, that is also a culture because it's the collective dynamics of any particular group. So a family is a culture. But the thing about all cultures, Lyle, is that they are all dysfunctional to a degree. The country is dysfunctional to a degree. The world is dysfunctional to a degree. So all group dynamics are dysfunctional to a degree. If you read a wonderful book by Yuval Noah Harari, Sapiens, and he talks about the fact that the maximum level that sapiens can function cohesively as a group is about 150, and then it starts to wobble. So culture always has this mix of constructive and destructive forces, and it is so totally self-consumed, like in a family. It dominates, and it overrides logic of the well-being of the system, i.e., in a sense, strategy. We want our family to be X, Y, Z. Culture is going to inhibit that or enable that, depending on how functional it is. So I would buy that 100%. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just while you're saying this, I'm just wondering what would happen if my family members spanned over 150 members. I think that would really see something tipping. That would be the tipping point again. But okay, so let me field a few of the questions and perform my role here as facilitator. And I did abuse it a little bit, and I might abuse it a little bit further by asking some of these questions around culture. I especially liked your fact that culture is sticky, but it also sticks. And that's why I do believe it is something that is very, very interesting. And we'll go back into the intercultural communication because I do think it is so fascinating in the world that we're living in right now. But Conrad Vijay, who my colleague and friend, he's obviously got a very strong personal interest in this. He's got a few questions. I'm going to ask one or two of them. Do you find that some leaders, he says, see the value of the blueprint process and others reject out of hand? I think maybe you can make some comment on this. He says that it seems to me that the process of establishing the blueprint for a company is a mini organization development intervention. So what is your view on that? And then he goes on, is blueprints about the head or the heart of the employees? And you did actually touch on this, but maybe you just want to repeat that in response to this. And then I've got a whole, now the questions are flying in, guys. So we'll get onto those as you've responded to that.
I'm going to give quick responses. So regarding leaders accepting or rejecting this, what I've discovered in my 25,000 hours doing this is that you get, obviously there's a whole spectrum and complexity in terms of types of leadership, but where this works well and where it does not work well, where you have transformational leaders, it works a gem because they're open to challenging the status quo. They desire and they infuse and imbibe this belief that the organization has to go to another space. You've got Pain Island and Pleasure Island. You want to get off Pain Island. You want to go to Pleasure Island. They see this as a boat. Where you get transactional leaders, Lyle, is they tend to default to maintaining the status quo, running things safely, seeing out their contract to 5 years, and don't want to rock the boat. So that's a quick answer to the type of leaders who accept this or don't accept this. And regarding, is this the head or the heart? I say it's the head, the heart, and the hands, because the head is the formulation of the formula, and there's obviously a cerebral, intellectual, statistical process. The heart is the art and the association that we make viscerally in our connection. And then the hands are the actual actions that are required on a continuous basis in terms of metrics, feedback loops, acting, building into KPIs. So it's the head, the heart, and the hands is how I see it.
While you were talking, I think this is maybe an exercise for everybody to do. when you're saying now you'll get these transformational leaders and you versus the transactional leaders, you also get organizations. You know, we've all been in large organizations where they say, you know, your role is not to change the organization, but actually, and it's also, it's a very, very interesting thing, because the transactional leaders often say, just make sure that this thing actually ticks over and you can maintain this. I think in the world that you've described now, because the other area, apart from culture, apart from intercultural communication, apart from the purpose of business, the other very, very important part that you do talk about quite deliberately is the future, and the future world of work. And this is how it kind of goes into this transformational process. But what I do think is very, very instructive for us is to use those different, I don't want to call them labels, but these different descriptions of leaders, of transformational leaders and transactional leaders. And for those of you that are home right now, just scribble down one or two of those types of leaders that you know, scribble down those organizations. And this might be instructive for you as case studies of where you can see this type of thing working. Because I think that's where guys help me. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking about organizations that we work with where this is actually particularly relevant. I've got another quick question, and it's related to these transformational leaders and maybe these organizations. And I'm not trying to set you up here or anything, or hand you any hospital pass here, Guy. But Conrad VG goes on and says, have you had any interest from government departments in South Africa, models that you've actually presented in this process, this journey that you can take organizations through?
Well, yes. And that was an interesting one. We were commissioned by government to do the formula for South Africa, and we involved 1 million people. The outcome is the most beautiful art gallery you can imagine. What was not expected, by the way, was the outcome of the South African formula, with all the rigor of the process, with a vast participation, resulted in something that government was not happy with. And that is because the constructs and reflected some discomfort, let's put it that way, in terms of how the country is currently being run. So I'll leave it at that, Lyle. And again, it goes back to the appetite. If there's a true appetite to transform, then this thing works a treat. But there are many cases, including many government environments, that actually have very little motivation to transform.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting, I think your response is interesting, and I particularly like the way you segued from being an Air Force pilot to being a global diplomat, and I do appreciate that enormously, guys. So thank you very much for that. So one of the questions here from John Sharp: how do you bridge the gap between short-term pressure on financial metrics and long-term focus on cultural change? Oftentimes, a culture shifts. A shift might mean a drop in results initially before it gets better. So basically, John's looking at the bottom line here and asking, you know, how are we going to manage this process if it's going to have some type of financial impact on the company?
Yeah. Okay. So because we partner with Deloitte, they've both been a client of ours for the last 14 years, and they also partner with us. So they do a lot of these kinds of associative knock-on impact studies. And one thing that they've done is that they've identified, both as a customer and as a researcher in other applications of where we operate, is that there's a lead and lag of between 4 months and 7 months from the point that the indications, so the metrics indicate where the organization's individual demographics are going, and some are going up and some are going down in the future. So they are a projection to the future of how successful those individual demographics are going to be. And they've identified that there's a between a 4 and a 7 month lag between what the indications show. Now we're into measurements, right? What the indications show and the degree and the impact on the financials. And where there is a distinct indication that an index is dropping in a certain demographic, regardless even of the justification of those outcomes, there is almost always an indication on their financials heading in a certain direction, either positively or negatively. So we haven't had a situation whereby the financials have been impacted negatively. Certainly not initially, but there's a lead and lag type effect. But you can correlate and predict what the hard metrics are going to look like between 4 and 7 months down the track.
Yeah, and I suppose this is also something that you've got to consider in terms of the medium term or immediate responses and long-term planning. Another question that's come in, Guy, is how does the blueprint process link to things like the selection of new employees and performance management? I just want to elaborate, maybe go further beyond that, because, you know, increasingly, and especially when you look at the millennials, they choose where they want to work, and organizations need to actually define their purpose a lot more clearly. They need to articulate it a lot more clearly, as opposed to attracting people through financial remuneration. So increasingly, and let's call ourselves millennials, even though you made some reference to flying jets in the 1980s, I can see that, like me, you're a millennial, and we will choose to work with organizations that have a particular purpose and a particular outlook to life and a particular impact on society. That's probably what drives, that's what gets us up every morning. So I think this question, and I think it's a really good one, because that talks to, you know, our personal purpose articulating into organizational purpose. But this question around how does the blueprint process link to the things like the selection of new employees? Because you will select from a particular pool and the performance management. I think that's a great question.
Fascinating outcomes that we've seen, because obviously we deal largely with large organizations, so that they have a range of complexities therein. One thing about the millennials is that they're much more purpose-driven than previous generations. So exactly to your point, purpose is very important to them. So they like the fact that the formula has been developed with a strong right-hand side of the equal sign. That's where we're going. That's our purpose. That's our raison d'etre. In the discovery of the mathematics from the statistics, we break down the voting results by demographic, and we have millennials separately to look at their priorities, because they have to be taken into account. In many organizations, they almost dominate the numbers. So we break them down, and in the codification of the formula, to make sure that their issues are in the formula, to make sure to keep the relevance up there. But thirdly is in the induction processes, how people are recruited. Individuals potentially joining the organization can be evaluated outside their obvious competencies regarding the academic and experiential backgrounds. They can be evaluated and are evaluated around the degree to which they fit the elements within the formula. And you can have 3 candidates, and they can have different metrics. And the one with the highest metric indicates that there's the highest match. That's on the recruiting level. Then there's a whole induction process, onboarding. I don't want to go through that. It's sort of quite complex, but so that people understand, as they come to the organization, they understand the soft issues without any ambiguity. So that's how we deal with the millennial aspect of things.
Okay. Guy, we're actually running out of time. So I've got one or two last points that I'm going to raise. And there's a question we've final remarks. But I see another question just coming from a chef under Sant, which I do want to pitch to you quickly. Let me pitch this one first, because I do think this is important. Has Guy synthesized any insights about directional shift in typical employee cultural attachments that companies encounter post-COVID? So I think this is why I think this is particularly interesting from Alicia. And what culture value shifts are we likely to see going forward? I think this is a great question, Alicia. And just to weave this in, Liesel Rees has actually asked one about, have you got any case studies that have gone through this process, of companies that have gone through this process and seen dramatic results and outcomes? I think maybe if you can combine the response to those two, we have about 2 or 3 minutes left. So maybe, and then I've got 1 or 2 thoughts that I want to just quickly share as we sign it off.
Okay, so regarding what's changed, obviously we have scores of clients, significant numbers of people, and we're doing measurements continuously. What has popped up in the lockdown period are a couple of things, positively and negatively. The positive aspects is that in many cases productivity has gone up because you don't have the logistics in between. There's been a tendency to shorten meetings quite often to half an hour versus an hour. So to be able to get more meetings done, easier to access people, easier to get them on board, easier to get to the point because there's not as much small talk around. The contra to that is that burnout is increasing. burnout is increasing, major psychological factors, this inability to feed back in any kind of sort of normal human non-verbal ways that I'm struggling here. I'm just responding to meeting process, commitment all along the way, and I'm burning out. And I also don't have the right kind of boundaries between myself, my work, and my domestic situation. So some positives and negatives. Some other challenges regarding performance management. More difficult to be able to ensure that people are delivering on what they should be delivering in the remote situation. So that's kind of those are my kind of key observations of what's popped out in the last couple of months from our measurements. Regarding the impact that it has on organizations, if your index rises by 50%, and every organization's index rises, which means that you've got evidence of the constructive factors growing, destructive factors diminishing. That in itself is evidence. But there are a whole series of academic case studies that have been conducted linking the transformation of the organizations into external customer experience impact and the financials that show, very frequently, in at least in 7 occasions, an ROIs of 100,000%. So, I mean, literally 1,000 times. I mean, the only reason why we, purpose-wise, we get out of bed. This is all just detail, guys. This is all just detail. This is about ensuring that you, like joining a gym, that you start at the gym and you end at the gym, and by the time you walk out, you have maximized your ability to become healthy and functional. The mechanisms to do that, but it's all just detail. And so transformation, it's what it is for us. Otherwise, we're not interested in doing it.
Those are profound thoughts, actually, as we end off. But Guy, thank you very much. I'm not going. There's just 1 or 2 points that I wanted to raise as I end off. By the way, your point around the burnout and what we've got to do. We've also got to be quite conscious about this, and this is part of our own personal purpose, and being a little bit more intentional about how we actually manage that balance. But my real takeaway is, I loved your point around how culture is intangible, but it's incredibly powerful, and probably one of the more powerful areas that we have to think about. I do take your point around most South African organizations actually don't have. They like to talk about their strategy, but they don't really have a functional strategy when we go forward, when we look at this thing. The intercultural communication, as you've said, this intangible of culture, it's incredibly sticky. And that also speaks to this area of strategy and how it's not only sticky, but it sticks. But I really do think this is a topic that we need to delve into in a lot more detail. And I look forward to doing that with you, because what is most important to me, working with and for certain organizations, what we are looking at doing and for the future world of work, is linking people to leadership. But more importantly, and often in these large corporate structures, the leadership needs to be linked back to the people again. And that's exactly what we've been talking about today. And what you've done really does help us do that. And we've seen this in the organizations that you've referenced. I see it in a number of these organizations that have got a very particular orientation and purpose, 1 or 2 of which also use art, and they've also got some of the largest art collections in South Africa. So that's why I appreciate that, so that reference to the graphic illustrations that you were chatting about. Guy Martin, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure and deeply insightful. I really do appreciate it. I look forward to the next conversation.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Adios.